Welcome to People Behind the Science. I'm Dr. Marie McNeely, and I am thrilled to have you joining me today for episode 655 with our guest, Dr. Tara Alvarez. As you know, listeners, through our podcast, we are working to introduce the world to scientists, science careers, and some exciting science. And if you support our mission and you want to support our program, you can donate through our crowdfunding campaign at patreon.com/sciencepodcast or visit the support page of our website at peoplebehindthescience.com/support. Every dollar makes a difference, and we really appreciate everyone who's helped us over the years continue sharing the stories of inspirational scientists. And today, Tara has some excellent stories to share. So listeners, get ready to meet another one of our wonderful people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Tara Alvarez. So, Tara, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing quite well, and I'm excited to learn more about you and the work that you're doing today. But before we dive into our interview questions, I do want to start by giving our listeners a little bit of background about who you are and how you got to where you are today. So listeners, Tara is professor of biomedical engineering at New Jersey Institute of Technology and chief scientific officer at OculoMotor Technologies. She was awarded her bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and her Ph.D. in bioengineering and biomedical engineering from Rutgers University. Afterwards, she conducted postdoctoral research at Bell Labs before joining the faculty there at New Jersey Institute of Technology. Now, Tara has received numerous awards and honors in her career, including an NSF Career Award, the Founding Members Award for Science from the Neuro-Optometric Rehabilitation Association, an Edison Patent Award, the New Jersey Institute of Technology Excellence in Research Award, and Augmented World Expo's Auggie Awards for Women XR Laureate and for Most Innovative Breakthrough. She has also been named an Outstanding Women Scientist of New Jersey, a Fellow of the American Academy of Optometry, and a Fellow of the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering. And today, Tara, we're excited to get to know you both as a scientist and also as a person. So can you start by telling us what you'd like to do when you're not doing science?
So I have two wonderful kids, Christian and Ariana, and I love spending time with them doing family things. I'm also a big do-it-yourselfer. I do a lot of home projects. I love building things, and I also enjoy cooking and gardening.
Oh, wonderful. Do you have any ongoing projects at home right now?
I do. I'm actually working on some molding in my foyer where I'm doing some wainscoting and some trim.
Oh, that sounds lovely. You'll have to come to my house next. Well, it sounds like you've got a wide variety of hobbies outside of research, but you're doing some very exciting science as well. So I'd love to dig into the details. So how do you start by talking to people about your work, and specifically people who might not be familiar with your line of research or your area?
So my roots are in electrical engineering, but really when I became a scientist, my goal was really to give back and help people. And I actually had thought about becoming a pediatrician or a physical therapist at one point in my life. But what struck me as something that would bother me is that there's so much that we don't know. And then I really started learning more about what it means to be a scientist and a researcher. And I really liked the concept of being able to tackle questions that nobody else had answered before. And what gets me really excited is I like to learn how the brain changes. And it is absolutely amazing how much information our brain takes in all the time, and we completely take it for granted. And this is particularly true for the visual system. We don't even realize how much information we're taking in visually until something goes wrong.
Definitely. And I know you study some of the ways that vision can go along and the brain changes that go along with it. So more specifically, I guess, what is your research focused on right now?
So I am one of the leading experts in how you go cross-eyed. And while that might not sound like a wonderful skill, you might want to think about it in a different context. When you're looking at your smartphone or you're reading a book or working on a computer, your eyes are actually converged to a particular visual plane. And you have to do sustained convergence for good amounts of periods of time in order to do any type of near work, such as reading texts or answering emails or reading your favorite novel. And about 5% of the general population has a condition that's known as convergence insufficiency, which means they have a difficult time doing work at near. And most of us can't really relate to this until it's actually happened to us. But imagine being able to read for only a few minutes before you started getting double or blurry vision, having headaches or eye stress and strain, and then the words appearing to float or having to constantly reread lines. This would put you at a disadvantage compared to your academic or professional peers. And what I'm recently funded to do by the National Institutes of Health, which is our taxpayer dollars at work, is about half of the people with persistent post-concussive symptoms. These are symptoms after you've had a concussion that just don't seem to go away 1 to even 3 months post-injury. About half of these patients have convergence insufficiency, which means they can read for only a few minutes at a time when their vision symptoms get so bad where they need to take a break. And what we're doing is we're doing vision rehabilitation on these folks and using functional imaging, eye movement recording, and standard optometric or eye exams to study how the brain is changing to lead to a sustained reduction in symptoms.
Phenomenal. And this sounds like really cool research. And I know the research in and of itself can be very motivating for scientists, but we love to get little bits of motivation and inspiration that we can share with our listeners as well. So do you have a favorite quote or a saying, Tara, that really resonates with you and keeps you motivated?
So one of the quotes I love a lot of inspirational quotes, but Gandhi is also one of my favorites. He says, "You must be the change you want to see in the world." So as a scientist, we're basically in the unknown. The reason we're doing this work is because we're the first to do it. And many times, and I'm talking many, many, many times, research is built on failure, and you will fail before you succeed. And you need to have confidence in what you're doing. And even if it doesn't go as planned, there will be positive contributions you can make to the world.
I love that quote myself as well. And as you mentioned, Gandhi is such an inspirational figure. Are there others who really rise to your mind who were these inspiring figures, or maybe scientists or mentors that you worked with over the years that had a big impact on you?
There's many. So I love reading lots of neuroscience. Von Kessel out of Boston is fantastic. Bruce Perry, I read a lot of his work. Brene Brown. One of the things that I also find fascinating is we have the power of positive thinking, and it's the intersection of psychology and the mind that intersects with neuroscience that we really don't completely understand. And we're just in the infancy of understanding how psychology and neuroscience integrate. And there are people that do very well with rehabilitation and others that don't. And trying to dig deep to really understand what is it that can lead to success for some people and not as successful outcomes for others is something I find fascinating and something that I will spend the rest of my career and life learning more and more about.
I love it. And I know I'm a neuroscience nerd myself, so this is an area that I am also especially passionate about. And I think it's interesting to hear about how people got into their particular areas of research. You mentioned that you already had these kind of early interests in maybe becoming a pediatrician or a physical therapist. Can you walk us all the way back to the beginning, Tara, and maybe tell us what first turned your eye towards science or medicine or these kinds of questions you're excited about?
I am very lucky in that my father has a Ph.D. in mechanical engineering. So I grew up with that. Now, one of the things, I'm also the director of the undergrad program here at NJIT, and I know not all kids have those experiences and exposure as a child, but I fortunately was around research at a very young age. And I was always fascinated in asking the question of why. How do things work? Why do they work? Can we make them better? And I had some great science teachers along the way. Mrs. Hansen was my 5th grade science teacher, who was absolutely fantastic. I've lost touch with her, but she was extremely impactful in my life. Then as I entered college, I had many different great professors. My PhD advisor, Dr. John Semlow, is still a colleague and a friend, as well as a key mentor. Then as I became more active in developing my own independent lab Dr. Mitchell Scheiman, who is my primary clinical collaborator, has been absolutely incredible in my journey. And I approached him through a cold email. I just read some of his papers. So I sent him an email and said, I'd really enjoy reading your work about randomized clinical trials to try to understand how effective vision therapy is. Would you be willing to talk to me? And at first he was a little confused because I'm a biomedical engineer and why would I be interested in optometry? But I explained that I was very interested in this particular area because it does rehabilitate so quickly. So it could serve as a model to better understand neuroplasticity or how the brain changes. And as soon as I said that to him, he said, absolutely. And we've been collaborating now for over 10 years. So there's been many, many advisors that I've had through the years that have really opened my eyes to different areas of science and just broadened my appreciation for integration of many, many different disciplines.
Definitely. So what were some of these key moments you think that really helped you get to where you are today in your career?
If I turn back the clocks, I have actually been studying convergence insufficiency for about 15 years. And it took me 7 years of failing before I actually successfully got my first NIH grant. And it was through some mentoring with Dr. Scheiman that I really started to ask questions about alternative hypotheses. And as a scientist, you can run the risk of becoming biased in that you have an idea and you want to run with it and you think that's the right idea. But if you want to be more open-minded, it's better to think about alternative hypotheses as well. Well, what if it's not your primary hypothesis or your primary guess as to what's going on? What are some other things that you can think about as to why certain things may be happening? And then some of the other courses I've had that have been very impactful is I study how we move our eyes and bring in visual information. There's also many other systems in the body, especially motor systems. And I see your background is in locomotive control and Parkinson's disease. Mm-hmm. The motor systems, while they're quite different, there is some general trends between these systems that we can learn about and actually enrich both fields. So the concept of doing things very quickly, but not necessarily so accurately, which would be a pre-programmed response, is an architecture that's rampant in the brain. And then these concepts of feedback control, which is how we regulate the heat in our house. We turn it to a desired temperature, and then the heater is going to add more heat or back off on the heat until we get to our desired target. Well, this is exactly how arm reaching works. We go for an object and we're going to adjust until we get to the intended target. That's how the visual system works as well. If we're looking at a target, the brain is going to zone in on it and try to adjust until it actually locks in to that particular target. So all of these different experiences give me a broad appreciation for many different areas of science. And I like learning about other areas of science so that I can take some of those ideas and apply it to my own area of expertise.
Definitely. And I think you bring a really unique perspective to this area of neuroscience as well, which I think is phenomenal. And you've got so many cool projects going on in the lab. Is there one in particular, maybe Tara, that you are the most excited about at the moment that you want to tell us about?
I have two. Mm-hmm. So one is like super sciencey for those of you out there that are big science zealots. And we still haven't completely published this yet, but we found one area of the brain which I didn't hypothesize or guess about at all. But it's actually the thalamus, which is in the brainstem, that seems to be one of the core areas of the brain that's involved in ocular motor or how we move our eyes. So that to me is thrilling. And it took me, just so people get an appreciation of how long, it took me 7 years of trying to get the NIH money to actually fund the research, and then another 7 years of studying before we got to that key finding. Another thing that I absolutely love is I also like to really leverage technology. And while I absolutely love science, most of the general population is not going to read my scientific papers and they're not going to read my grant proposals. So my personal mission is actually to take some of this knowledge that I've acquired and really make that broader impact and get it out into society. So this is where me being a chief scientific officer really speaks to this part of what I enjoy doing. And I'm working with Dr. Mitch Scheiman. He's the chief medical officer, as well as Chang Yaramoto and John Vito D'Antonio Bertinoli, who are the CEO and CTOs of our company, where we're leveraging virtual reality to create a video game that is working based on eye movements. So instead of using a handheld controller to manipulate your Xbox or your PlayStation, what people are doing is they're putting on a virtual reality headset and they're playing a game by moving their eyes. And we actually have eye tracking installed in the headset. And if they do a good eye movement, then the game gets harder. And if they're having a rough day and their eye movements aren't as strong as they could be, then the game actually gets easier. And this leads to personalized therapy. And the reason I love this so much is that it can get more broadly disseminated in the US as well as internationally. And a lot of these techniques are not reimbursed by insurance companies. So this could be a way to help people in a much broader sense. So those are the two things that I really enjoy. And another great thing about being a professor is that I also get to work with a lot of students and help them get to their next career goals.
Oh, that is so cool. Well, I think we could talk about these exciting projects all day, but I know we've only got an hour. But I have to ask, a lot of our listeners out there might be scientists. They might be kind of only familiar with this traditional academic path. What was it like for you becoming involved with this company, OculoMotor Technologies?
It was exhilarating, scary, and an enormous amount of work. Like you said, I'm one of those classically trained Ph.D. people. I graduated from Rutgers. I lived in a lab for many years. I did many projects. Those led to publications that eventually led to grants. And I did that until I was tenured. However, being in an engineering school, and we actually have one of the best reviewed gaming design programs at NJIT, I started thinking about how Dr. Scheinman's results led to very poor results for home therapy. And one of their key findings is that home therapy is actually no more effective than placebo. And I was curious, is this because patients just hate doing these exercises because they're incredibly boring, right? Just like our sports equipment at home gathers dust? What was the core reason? So to me, this translational component is really going to hopefully be impactful. We're in the middle of our randomized clinical trial. We're going for FDA approval, actually FDA clearance this summer. And we're collecting data to determine whether or not our virtual reality vision therapies is indeed effective. And the name of our software is called Verve, and it's also patented in the US as well as several other countries. And right now, while we're still collecting data, we're at about 95% effectiveness. And that in itself is very exciting and worth all the long hours it's taken to really build this company.
Absolutely. And I think right there you hinted at just some of the challenges, some of the struggles, and just the long time it takes to make important progress in science. And I think these are some of the things that people may not understand about the career. So can you tell us maybe in a little bit more detail about a time that you've had a big failure or you really struggled with something and how you were able to work through it?
I've had several. And one of the things that especially young aspiring scientists may not realize when they look at somebody who you would quote unquote call successful, a lot of people don't like to talk about their failures. I, on the other hand, love to talk about my failures because as an assistant professor and as a PhD student, I questioned whether or not I was meant for this career. And now, as a full professor and being almost 50, I can say with certainty that I absolutely love what I do. But when I was in my 20s and 30s, I was constantly questioning because I was failing. And it didn't seem like any of my mentors that I was aspiring to be had that much failure. So I did mention that my first NIH proposal actually took 7 tries before it was successfully funded. And finally, I went to my PhD advisor and I said, John, I don't understand why I'm not getting this. I'm working so hard and it's just not working. And he says, well, how many times have you submitted? And I said, well, I've already submitted 5 times, like different proposals, but none of them have gotten funded yet. And he says, it took me 11. You're doing great so far. And that to me was a huge eye-opening experience because it is a long road and all of my proposals have gotten much better because I've taken that advice to heart. And that was a very critical moment in my own personal growth as well as my career, because instead of looking at the comments as being personally attacking, like I wasn't good enough, instead of what I did is that these people are investing their time to actually help me grow. So their comments then became constructive. And I started looking at it as, that's actually a very good point. I didn't think of that. Let me sit with this and figure out how I can actually address their concern. So what finally did get funded is so much better than my very first proposal to the NIH. And then the other thing is hypotheses. I have been proven wrong more than I've been proven right. And that's okay, because you, as a scientist, you never falsify data, but your guesses or your hypotheses can be proven wrong. And that's just part of the job. Then what you do is you look at the data and you try to explain, well, what are these data actually trying to teach me? What is it that I can learn from this? And how can we find new hypotheses that may be actually more accurate?
Oh, well, Tara, I love this story that you shared. And I think a big take home here is just not to give up. You can get rejected 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 11 times and still be successful at the end of that path, as long as you kind of continue adapting, continue growing, and you don't give up.
Correct. I 100% agree with you.
Well, I think you've had many successes to celebrate as well. And I want to make sure we don't miss our chance to celebrate these with you. So do you have a favorite success, Tara, that you've experienced, whether it was a big win or just a small but particularly meaningful victory that you'd like to share with us?
I've had, fortunately, many successes that I'm extremely proud of. So my NIH grant that did get funded actually was in the top 5th percentile.
Oh, wow.
So that was a very big win for me. I also received the Excellence in Research Medal here at NJIT, and my daughter actually came up to the podium with me to accept the award, and that was also a very big win. Our company has actually won a IEEE VR Auggie award on being the most innovative breakthrough award, and that was also fabulous. But some of the more smaller awards that nobody hears about are actually the letters I've received from parents or from college students about how we've successfully remediated their symptoms, and they've gone on to successful careers because now they can read for longer periods of time comfortably.
That is wonderful. And I think all of these different kinds of successes are really meaningful. How do you celebrate some of these victories?
For me, it's having dinner with my kids. It's going for a long hike and just being still for a period of time and just soaking it in. Because one of the things that I think all of us can relate to, and I'm speaking as a scientist as well as somebody who's trying to build a startup company, is we're so busy running around trying to get all these little things off of our to-do list that sometimes it's nice to just take a pause and say, wow, that's actually making a difference and helping others. And that's really good. And sometimes you need that reserve because the failures will come and they're not going to feel so good. Mm-hmm. And taking that break to just realize like, yeah, what I'm doing actually is making a difference does help.
I think that is so important. Taking a moment, taking a couple deep breaths and savor that moment before you kind of steel yourself to get back into the battle, I think is so important. And I know you're balancing a lot in terms of your scientific career as well as this startup work that you're doing. So we always like to tell our listeners that you should take some time out for yourself. And I think this totally goes along with your previous response. But one of the things we like to encourage people to do is to read broadly and read for fun. So do you have a book recommendation that you can share with our listeners, whether it's related to science or not, for a book that you particularly enjoyed?
Several. I read all the time. I'm probably reading 3 books simultaneously, but I really enjoyed Buddha's Brain, which is the intersection of neuroscience, which I know quite well. And then it was the intersection of neuroscience, psychology, and mindfulness. So that book was very impactful to me. I loved reading Lean In. I loved reading Brené Brown's Dare to Lead. So I read all kinds of books. I read science books on neuroscience and psychology. I read leadership books. I read books about diversity. I read books about how to more effectively manage your time, how to build habits. So all kinds of stuff.
Fantastic. Well, we will add your specific recommendations to our book list on our website for our listeners. And I'm glad to hear you do take the time out to kind of broaden your interest, broaden your perspective on the world by reading all these different types of books. I think that's so important. And I think in science, you also broaden your perspective and your experiences through travel. And this is something, unfortunately, that's been a bit hampered, but I think things are moving back in the direction where you're starting to travel for conferences and to work and meet with colleagues. So do you have a favorite place, Tara, that science has taken you?
Paris, without a doubt. I absolutely enjoy and love Paris. I actually worked with Essilor International for about 15 years, which is based out of Paris. So I've been working with them for a long time to try to understand why some people easily adapt to progressive additive lenses. Those are the bifocals without the line, and why other people do not. But one of the many benefits of being a scientist is that you work with people all over the world. I just gave a talk to people from the Prasad Institute, which is one of the premier vision centers in India. I've given invited talks throughout all of Europe. I gave one during the pandemic to people in Italy, Estonia. I've traveled throughout the US. And to me, travel really broadens you intellectually as well as culturally and personally. So I have many colleagues all over the place. Actually, I have very good friends, Steffi Gente from Germany. Her and I have been trying to get funded for a while to do vision therapy, both in the US and in Germany, to understand how the brain changes. And that's one of the projects that we're starting up with the people in India. I think it's really important to see how different scientists approach different problems and how they do things, and have to also how they approach life. So travel is a big part of my career. You're right. It's been on hold because of COVID, but I'm very excited about that resuming.
Definitely. And you mentioned Paris as an all-time favorite. If our listeners are able to go soon, what is something they must see or do there?
Oh, there's so much. Sacré-Cœur is absolutely brilliant if you go, especially on a Sunday, to listen to their choir. I loved going to Versailles. And if you go there on a certain Sunday of the month and it fluctuates, they'll turn on the fountains and you'll listen to classical music. And this is one of the benefits of going with people who are local to the area. I've been to some incredible restaurants that are not necessarily in the tour books because it's a local favorite. And the cuisine is just absolutely phenomenal, like really amazing food. The cheese is fantastic. The wine is excellent. So there hasn't been any aspect of Paris that I didn't enjoy. I love it all.
That's wonderful. I've been there once myself and I was blown away by just the art, the history, the people, everything. So great recommendation there for our listeners. And we touched on travel, but I think one of the other things that people may not realize about scientists is that we're not just in the lab all the time. And I think this sort of surprises people when they don't take a step back and think about it. But I think the media often portrays scientists as very serious, very critical, and always working. But some of the funniest, most creative people I know are scientists, and these little quirks and traditions come up over the years. And I think it's fun to share these to break some of these stereotypes that people may have about scientists. So do you have a story of your own, Tara, that really shares this human side of science that people may not always see?
Absolutely. So part of giving talks is to learn about what people in that area enjoy doing. And one of my favorite things to do is to ask people what is their favorite local restaurant and why. And you get all kinds of different responses. The other key question I love to ask people is, what is a book that really changed your life and why? Of course, as a scientist, you're always asking why. And you get really interesting questions. The other thing you can start learning is scientists are very creative people. You don't come up with a hypothesis unless you're being creative. So there's a lot of overlap with musicians and artists in terms of the creative process. So I absolutely love museums because it works a different part of the brain. Impressionism is my favorite type of art. So if you do go to Paris, highly recommend the Dosé. But part of being a scientist is being creative. And I don't know if necessarily society realizes that, but sometimes you get data that's very fuzzy and very difficult to interpret. And the fun of it is actually trying to put together the puzzle and see what it actually is saying to you.
Oh, definitely. Well, I love that description there. And I think you're absolutely right that this creativity comes in when you're puzzling over data that might go against your hypotheses, data that sort of doesn't make any sense at first glance. So I think that is so true for life as a scientist.
And the other thing with scientists is sometimes it takes years. I've actually sat on data for years that I didn't understand. And then having a conversation with somebody. So Cliff Shore is another one of my greats. He's retired from Berkeley. And we were working on this problem, and he started talking about sailing and about having something be like an anchor. And that to me was like a light bulb moment. Like, that's what this data is actually saying, because it seemed counterintuitive until he and I were having that conversation, which really wasn't about the science at all. We were just talking about sailing. So you never know when intuition is going to really be insightful, and it could be on something that's not related to science directly at all.
I love that. And I think you're absolutely right. Now, in your lab today, do you have fun traditions or things that you like to do with your group to kind of get them out of the lab and help them broaden how they think and think more creatively?
Unfortunately, a lot of these traditions have been put on hold because of COVID, but I like to get my lab members out of the lab, and we'll do different activities. We've done escape rooms. And if you don't know what an escape room is, it's like this challenge where you're given a topic and you have to solve the challenge, where you're given different clues and as a group. And this is where it becomes really interesting to see how people work together or independently. And if you answer the riddle that they're trying to get you to answer, you get a prize, so to speak, by understanding where the lost city is or where the superhero went, which is always fun. And then we'll go to a restaurant afterwards. And then the rule is that we don't talk science, because we do talk science, obviously, a lot in the lab. But I think it's also important for students to realize that there's also another side to life, and it's not just science if they want to be successful. And I do want to hear about if they want to go on camping trips or go for a painting party or go to a play or any of those different outings.
Definitely. Well, it sounds like you have a wonderful lab environment where you're, like I said, encouraging people to not just develop scientifically, but to embrace these other interests that they have in life, which I think is so important. And I think having that supportive lab environment is so key for teamwork, for working together to solve some of these difficult problems that you're addressing in the lab. Because I think there's enough barriers that scientists are facing, whether it's staff, time, technology, even feasibility of the projects you're trying to tackle. So if we took away all of the normal barriers that you face, Tara, is there one research question that you would want to solve most?
How does the brain change? And how can we leverage that to actually help different types of patients?
Interesting. So what is the biggest barrier keeping you from tackling it?
Well, actually, I am tackling it, but in a very isolated condition. And what I would love to do, but again, this is a matter of needing more time, is to work with people that are also trying to understand how the brain changes. And this can be people that are studying different types of cognitive therapies, different forms of rehabilitations. So even though I am definitely in an interdisciplinary area and much more interdisciplinary than other areas of science, I'm still studying vision and ocular motor rehabilitation. I would love to go broader to work with leading experts in other areas of rehabilitation and learn what they have found and try to come up with, is there an overarching model? So some of the things that keep me up at night is learning centralized or distributed or both? And what I mean by that is, are there parts of the brain that are only used for one particular system, like hand reaching or moving your eyes or how we integrate information? Or are there areas in the brain, and that would be distributed, like each area of the brain has its own job? Or do we have areas of the brain which are responsible for, hey, this is something new and I want to learn something new? And then that's more of like a centralized mechanism. And usually what happens in science is that there could be combinations of both taking place. And I would love to have the time to work with people in different areas to learn about what they're finding and see what kind of overlaps and what differences we have in terms of what we're finding out about the brain.
Oh, very interesting. Well, these are fascinating questions, Tara. Thank you for giving me and our listeners something to ponder for the rest of our day here. And I know you've shared quite a bit with us. We'd love to end with advice. So is there one piece of advice that you received at some point, Tara, that was just so helpful that you'd like to pass on to our listeners today?
I actually spoke to one of my mentors, John Lee. He's a neurologist from Case who's retired. This is also in one of my down days where like things weren't going well. And I called him up and I was struggling. And he said, you know what? You have tenacity. And it took me back a little bit. And I'm like, oh, I guess that's a compliment. But my piece of advice to people is to really find out what they enjoy doing and making a career of it. And I know that's very cliche, and a lot of people tell that to the next generation. But you can also do this at any phase in your career too. This is not just something that you're going to be telling teenagers and 20-year-olds. My partner is doing a job change right now where he wants to go from project management into social work and therapy. So this could be at any phase of your life. And getting into neuroplasticity, we have the ability to change throughout our life. So I think my biggest piece of advice is to not be afraid and actually just go for it and see what happens. Because the only way you know that it won't work is if you don't try to make it work.
I think this is wonderful advice because you're absolutely right. There's no reason you can't make these changes even later in your career, later in your life, because if your interests are changing, you should try to change your career so that you're still able to work on the things that excite you most.
Dr. Scheinman went back for his Ph.D. when he was 65.
Oh, wow.
He had an optometry degree, and he had done so much positive literature on clinical trials for vision therapy, but he wanted to dig deeper and learn more about objective measurements in science. So he went back and got a Ph.D. and learned how to do eye movement recording and understand more of the neural control of what was going on. So that's also another key piece of advice I give to people, that regardless of your age, you can always be reinventing yourself and challenging yourself with the next big thing. And that might be very different in your 50s and 60s than when you were in your 20s or 30s.
That is a phenomenal, wonderful message to leave our listeners with today. Tara, is there any other last piece of inspiration or advice you'd like to end on?
The last piece of advice I'd like to share with people is convergence insufficiency is not screened for in the school system the way visual acuity is. That is how you need glasses. So if you yourself or somebody you know is struggling and they're very visually symptomatic, like it should not hurt, meaning headaches and eye strain and stress. I mean, if we all read for 5 hours straight, yes, you're going to get tired. But if you're reading for only 15, 20 minutes and you're starting to get vision symptoms, reach out to an eye care professional and tell them about these symptoms, because they don't necessarily do the exam unless you are complaining about symptoms. And the challenge with these things is that if this is your only visual environment and you've always struggled with reading for more than 15, 20 minutes, you may not even realize that that's not right. But you've had it your whole life, so you've adapted to it. But these are things that are treatable, and you can be screened and diagnosed for them. And doing vision therapy usually is quite successful in remediating these symptoms. So that's the last piece of advice I'd like to give people.
Well, thank you for that. And we appreciate you sharing this insight and also sharing all of the stories that you shared with us today. If our listeners want to learn more, what is the best way for them to do so?
If you go to my website, which maybe you could add that wherever you're posting information, but you can also just search Alvarez at NJIT and you'll see my webpage. And that talks a lot about the different things that we're doing. You could also look up our company, which is OculoMotor Technologies. And that's where we list the different products that we're trying to develop and where we are in that process.
Phenomenal. Well, listeners, definitely check out these resources. Learn more about the amazing work that Tara is doing, both in her lab and in her company as well. And Tara, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show with us today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's been great to meet you. Listeners, wonderful to have you here with us as well. If you haven't yet, we would love it if you could take a moment to leave a review on your favorite podcast platform to let us know what you think of the show. And we'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.